Welcome to our webinar. We're very happy to have you here today. We'll be presenting 3 projects related to measuring outcomes in victim services. The first presentation today will be for a project called What Constitutes Success? Evaluating Legal Services for Victims of Crime. That will be presented by myself, Chris Lugo-Grolick from the Justice Research and Statistics Association, and Meg Garvin from the National Crime Victim Law Institute. After that, we'll be hearing about measuring the impact of victim services, and that will be presented by Lynn Langton and Stacy Cutbush from RTI and International, and Bailey Merrifield from JRSA. And then lastly, we will be hearing about measuring success in the criminal justice system's response to domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And that will be presented by Sarah Gohn and Elizabeth Snell from the University of Maine. So jumping into our first presentation, which is about the formative evaluation that we did of Victim Legal Services Program. Again, that was a partnership between JRSA and the National Crime Victim Law Institute. We wanted to thank the National Institute of Justice and the Office of Justice Programs for providing the grant that funded this research, and to offer the little disclaimer that the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Department of Justice. So with that, just to introduce how this project came to be, several years ago, the Office for Victims of Crime launched an initiative called Vision 21 that was looking at the future of crime victim services. And they had a special emphasis, among other things, in Vision 21, where they made a lot of recommendations about victims' rights enforcement. However, within victim legal services, there has been a lack of systematic evaluation so far in terms of what works in victim legal services, rights on paper versus rights in practice, things like that. And there's also been a lack of definitions for success that could serve as sort of a unified roadmap for practitioners about best practices or standardized procedures. So when we looked at this process to start the evaluation process with several legal clinics that we were working with, we realized that it was going to be really important to first go through a process where we define what success looks like, and then figure out how to measure that with on-the-ground data. And so our project consists of 2 main parts, which include the development of a conceptual model for victim legal services generally. And then the second part was a pilot test of an evaluation framework based on that model with 3 victims' rights enforcement legal clinics in preparation for future process and outcome evaluation phases. So we're going to talk first about stage 1 of the work, which was the development of the conceptual model, and the process that was involved with that involved collaboration with an advisory board of 18 different victim legal service providers and some survivors as well. So we started by interviewing all of these individuals to learn how they viewed victim legal services. We later took that information and did a first draft of the model. And then we did a wider survey of a total of 104 practitioners to get their initial reactions to that before we brought the second version of the model to a roundtable at NCVLI's conference in Portland. But through this process, we learned a lot about working between researchers and practitioners. I'm just going to toss it to Meg Garvin right now to talk a little bit more about this process.
Sure. Again, hi everyone, Meg Garvin, she, her pronouns. We're gonna unfold some of this training with some reminders, the reminders / lessons learned. And this reminder, right? Lawyers, legal service providers, and researchers, we have two very different sets of expertise. I am a lawyer by trade, and what Chris just described was not only bringing together lawyers and researchers, but it was bringing together a whole group of different types of lawyers. So also within the legal field, we each have expertise. Mine is in rights enforcement, but we had civil legal service providers at the table too. And when you have everyone around the table thinking about the conceptual model, it led to really robust conversation. And amongst lawyers, some of the ways we have deep conversations is to debate, to argue, to talk about in really challenging ways. And so as we were building the conceptual model, we had to ask challenging questions across researchers and lawyers, but also across lawyers. What does success in victim legal services mean? And I'm going to back it up. We started with that question, and then we actually said, what is victim legal services?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We had to ask, what are victim legal services? What are the essential elements and characteristics that define success? What case outcomes can capture success? And then we started to break down, what is case, right? What is a case, so that then we can do it? And then what are client outcomes? How is service delivery and organization designed to achieve all of this? Those became all of the questions we were asking, and they became a deep discussion. As we were getting there, the model considerations that we had to really think about what outcomes are achievable for individuals, right? Because we were trying to figure out what's success for the client, what is success for the victim, right? The victim client. We had to think about objectives that are ideals to strive for, because the lawyers, we were aiming for what is the best that we can be doing, right? The conceptual model we landed on, we really focused on legal services, which made that first question so important. What are victim legal services? And then we also, because we had this diversity of lawyers around the table, each of whom were saying, no, this is what my legal services are. This is what my legal services are, all of which are important. We had to make sure that the model was able to be customized based on what an agency was doing to serve survivors. So it was a really robust thing. And we kept having to remind ourselves we have different expertise so we could have conversations. Mm-hmm. Chris, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, great. So just to briefly show you an outline of what our project methodology was. We mentioned the interviews with subject matter experts and the different stages that we went through to revise and finalize the conceptual model, and then which we will show you a higher level version of it a little bit later when we talk about how we tested operationalizing it and using it in practice in 3 real legal clinics. And so the second stage that we'll talk about there involved collaboration on evaluation design, site visits where we collected a lot of program data and interviewed stakeholders with all 3 of the different programs, which I'll talk about in a second. We developed that research framework collaboratively to pilot test evaluation designs and evaluation data collections with these clinics to determine how ready are they to move to a full evaluation, which is great to have the opportunity to do this preparatory informative work before doing a full evaluation, because that allows us to course correct. And when we get to later stages of evaluation, to be able to just really put something forward with that will have a higher likelihood of success in producing results that can be used in practice. So the 3 clinics that we worked with were the Oregon Crime Victims Law Center in Portland, Oregon, the Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center, and the Arizona Voice for Crime Victims. And let's see, okay. So the process that we went through with them, this is what we did after the conceptual model was complete. Again, we did site visits and interviews to learn about their programs. We took that information to create program-specific logic models and service delivery process flows that started with the conceptual model and then got very specific to the individual clinic because they're all fairly unique, as Meg was saying. We identified measures to collect outcome data and created data collection tools and reporting mechanisms. Specifically, we worked on revisions to the client satisfaction survey, as well as shifting delivery in 2 clinics' cases from paper delivery to electronic delivery. And we also collected data on activities performed and organizational data. These things came from the case management system. We tested data collection and reporting over a 6-month period and then evaluated the data quality, completeness, utility, and reliability for the purposes of, if we do a full outcome evaluation, is what we're able to collect going to work. And so in the formative stage, that's the type of evaluation we're doing versus evaluating their services at this time, is what we're proposing going to work is the point in terms of that. So we had another reminder that came to the forefront in that whole process, putting together the pilot tests and executing the pilot tests. And that was that lawyers and legal service providers and researchers need to have ongoing conversations. It was often the case that even with deep collaboration, you always think that you have an understanding of what's happening, and then find out, that since researchers and lawyers speak different languages a bit, that maybe that understanding isn't perfectly clear. And so for evaluation success, you've got to have that constant ongoing conversations and communication, not only on what you're doing, but what your understanding is of what exactly, what the project is and what the objectives are, why we need data even, all of that sort of thing. As happened with many evaluations, the unexpected happens and gums up the works a little bit. When the COVID-19 pandemic initially hit in March of 2020, that was about the time we were originally going to launch our pilot tests. And that clearly upended everything that we were going to do. And so besides just causing a delay in the project itself, it also completely changed how victim legal services were operating. The clinics had to go through quite the adaptation period to just figure out, okay, what do we do now? Courts delayed, all of these different things. After a bit of shock, we decided in our project that rather than fight COVID, we should incorporate it into the research design. And we did that initially by conducting interviews with the executive directors, a lawyer, and an advocate or social worker from each site to just find out what is happening and how is this affecting you? Is it just proceeding formats? What's going on in your world? And so I'm just going to actually toss it back to Meg for a second to talk a little bit more about that before we go to the next slide.
Chris, I think you covered it really well, and it comes back to the lesson learned before that, right? Which is ongoing conversation. When COVID came up, it resulted in ongoing conversation that then became formalized in some interviews. So then we could be assessing what are the legal services again, and how are we doing it? So it was horrible, and I'm grateful that each of the clinics, as well as JRSA, were able to think about how do we start to analyze through COVID, not putting a pin in COVID and pretending that we're going to get back to some different legal services. And really all the legal services providers started to think about, well, what are we going to do through COVID and then after COVID? And I think that leads us to our next reminder, right, which is assessing the services in relation to the conceptual model to determine if the service or model needs adjustment during the process. COVID was this large bump, right? But it led all of us, and as a practitioner, it really grounded how often you have to revisit the conceptual model. along the way and just start thinking, is this going to work? Is the service going to work? Is the model going to work? What needs adjustment? How do you think about it so that you can actually start getting prepared to have the full evaluation, which in the field is what we ultimately want. We want to know, are our legal services having the impacts we hope for? But we often don't let ourselves have this process time to get ready. So this reminder of continually assessing in relationship to or in relation to the conceptual model was a really good lesson for the and reminder for the legal side of things. I think researchers, you do it more naturally, but lawyers, Chris kept putting the conceptual model, and the entire team at JRSA kept putting the conceptual model in front of us, and it was very valuable. And so Chris, I'm gonna turn it back to you to talk about how did we measure success?
Absolutely. So this is a little bit more high-level version of the model. We've had a much more detailed one as well. And so we measured, we collected measures in 3 different categories. The first was the program activities, which is collected mostly from the case management systems. During the pilot test, in order to incorporate COVID a little bit as well, we had collected some additional information about the activities performed in terms of COVID-related delays that might have been associated with any of those, and also whether the activities happened in a virtual, in-person, or a telephone setting. That from there, we've hypothesized that, of course, the activities would lead to short-term outcomes. We had victim and survivor outcomes, which were the primary ones that we looked at, and we chose really perception-based outcomes so that we could ask about them via the client satisfaction survey. Things like victims report understanding their rights. They report being informed about the status of their case. Victims report being given clear expectations about processes and possible outcomes. Victims receive services tailored to their expressed needs, and victim receives an outcome that they perceive as just. And we had some other ones in there too, but if the victim doesn't feel that we've met their needs, then we haven't necessarily succeeded. So we wanted to get those perception-based outcomes. We also attempted to get some more data also on system and community outcomes, which were a little bit more difficult. We did get some organizational level data on training and outreach. We also attempted to get referrals received in as the result of specific trainings or outreach activities as a measure of the success of those activities. One of the findings from the pilot test is that there needed to be a little bit more system refinement before we could implement that in a full outcome evaluation, which is fine. That's the reason that we do formative work, is to learn about what are those additional things that we need to do to just make sure everything would be ready. We also had some long-term objectives, which are the deeper impacts that we hope will be achieved if the short-term outcomes are achieved regularly. And so we also asked some survey questions, especially that were related to empowerment or self-efficacy, trust in the legal system, and things like that. The other thing that we did is we used the program activities data and compared those against the process flows that we've developed with the sites before the pilot test, matched those up to understand whether basically were the clinics doing what they told us that they do. And so the fidelity measurement actually went quite well, and so that boded well for future evaluation as well. We had a couple of important lessons that we learned about specific measures during this process. There were some concepts where we tested the utility of a single question against a couple of different scales. We tested a scale related to self-efficacy. We tested a court empowerment scale to capture trust in the legal system. And we also tested a social support skill to get at that functional reintegration into a community. And in 2 of the 3 cases, the single question report performed better than the scale, which is good for easing survivor burden in terms of having to answer so many questions on a survey. But in the case of the court empowerment scale for trust in the legal system, that gave us a much more variation in response and what we were able to learn about how different clients may feel about that for the trust in the legal system. So we got a lot of great information that was able to help us determine, are these programs ready to move to a full evaluation? Holy et al. In 1986 and 2004 in their seminal work on formative evaluation had 4 criteria for determining whether a program was ready to move to the next stage of evaluation. And we were very fortunate in our pilot test to learn that our 3 programs basically meet all 4 criteria for moving forward. They were ready to move to the process evaluation, which besides getting into some more qualitative data about how services are delivered and not just what services are delivered. And during that period, we were going to use that time to resolve any data collection or case management system revisions that were still needed before an outcome evaluation could happen, which is exactly what you want to learn in a formative evaluation. So we were happy with that success. As a result of this, we have a few ideas that we're tossing around for what that final outcome evaluation might look like. Random assignment is not necessarily possible in victim legal services for ethical and also research reasons. So we are looking at rigorous quasi-experimental designs using either propensity score matching or matched comparison groups as possibilities. And we're also looking at potentially using the 3 sites as comparisons for each other. There are things they have in common and also things that are unique about them. But there are 2 sites, Oregon and Arizona, that while they have difference, they're a little bit similar in size and approach and things like that. Whereas Maryland is a much bigger agency with a much different organization. So we could potentially use Maryland as a most different sort of case. We were also looking at potentially doing an interrupted time series design, perhaps related to COVID changes to services, or a simple pre-test and post-test and post-test if neither one of those works out. But we're really thinking that the first 2 are likely to work well. And I'm just going to toss it to Meg here to talk about how the conceptual model worked even when everything was upended.
Well, I know we are pretty much out of time, so I'll jump right to the next slide. And the answer of yes, the model still works. And the theory of change really did hold constant. We were looking at how do we serve survivors through legal services as a practitioner. And the way I do that changed during COVID and will likely continue to evolve, but the model that was developed and the theory that was developed actually held constant. And so that is a huge plus for the field.
Excellent. Yeah, so our final conclusion here that we just think is, especially for people who may be new to working with evaluation, is that evaluation is an iterative process. It requires time to reassess the agency's services and mission and the conceptual model in case that needs tweaking as well, to see where the agency fits and if the model fits the agency, especially during times of change. So we've got our contact information up here. I'm not going to leave it up for too long in the interest of time, but these slides again will be available after the webinar if you just request them during the final survey. So Jason, I'm tossing it to you for the first poll question.
Yes, please go ahead and respond to the poll. Looks like we're getting some responses there. Just let us know what is most important when measuring success.
And with my view, Bailey, I can't see it, so I'm going to count on you to tell everybody what folks are saying.
Yes, will do. Yeah, Jason, I think you can probably go ahead and close it for us. There we go. So it looks like our #1 result was agreeing on criteria to measure performance. And I think I would just certainly agree with that. Second was bridging the gap between researchers and practitioners. And then availability of data was next. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna toss it over to Lynn and Stacy and Bailey to talk about measuring the impact of victim services, developing the victim outcome and satisfaction survey.
Great, thank you, Chris. And before I start, I just want to note the disclaimer at the bottom of the slide here. So this effort is also funded by DOJ, but the views are ours and do not necessarily reflect DOJ. And with that, I think we can jump right into the details. Okay, so the overarching goal of this project is to move the victim service field from a focus on effort to a focus on results and effectiveness. So we're really trying to shift the field from primarily measuring outputs to measuring outcomes and the quality of services. So the first key activity is to develop a survey instrument that can be completed by survivors to measure both the impact of services on their lives and also their perceptions of the quality of services and their interactions with providers. One of the big challenges with this part is that the field is so diverse and different services have different intended impacts. And so we have to ensure that our outcome measures are aligned with the intended impacts of services. But then there's also still a need to have some standardization so that the measures can be analyzed at an aggregate level, like at the state level or the federal level. So we're also developing a standardized methodology to ensure consistency and best practices in how the survey is administered. And for both of those pieces, the instrument and the methodology, we're very much building on the work that's already been done across the field, which Bailey will talk about shortly. So the second activity is to customize an intuitive, freely available software application for administering the survey instrument and for analyzing and using the data. And then we're also engaging in rigorous testing of the VOS instrument and platform, and finally developing a toolkit with guidance for victim service providers on accessing and using the platform and the data that are generated. Next slide, please. So when I say we're doing all of these different things, this slide shows you the we that I'm referring to. So this project was awarded and is led by the National Institute of Justice, but it's funded by the Office for Victims of Crime and the Office for Violence Against Women, and all three agencies are actively involved in the effort. My organization, RTI International, which is a research organization based in North Carolina, is the prime on the award, but we partner with JRSA and with our colleagues from the Georgia Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, who have a lot of experience measuring victim service outcomes in the state of Georgia. And then we also have two consultants, both of whom have considerable experience working with victim service providers and on outcome measurements specifically. And then beyond this, we also have heavy involvement and input from the victim service field through several advisory groups. And Bailey, I'll pass the baton to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, as Lynn mentioned, our project team goes far beyond what we showed you on the last slide. We knew it when we were writing this proposal, and it was actually recommended in the solicitation that it would be important to include a panel of experts to help advise our work. So the expert panel is a group that either provides significant expertise in an area of victim outcomes, or they bring perspective of key implementing constituencies, such as a state VOCA administrator. Then as we started getting further into the project, we realized we needed to expand our advisors even further to ensure more of the field was aware of our work and that their input was part of what we were doing. So this gave birth to the Project Input Committee, which we call the PIC. This larger PIC includes individuals with other important perspectives, and they have, we engage them less often than we do the expert panel, but they're definitely still heavily involved with our work. Then as we got further into the project, we realized we were still missing a very important area of victim services, which are those that are organizations by and for underserved populations. So we created, another small panel of experts to help advise us on how to best develop outcome measures for organizations serving these underserved populations. Working on the wording of questions, what outcomes should we be looking at, and of course, how those data can be utilized. So we've met with these advisors often. We actually met with them again yesterday. They've been critically important to our project so far, and hopefully the ultimate success of it, and have also been really important with us helping ensure survivor voices are included through helping us with recruitment efforts with various testing activities. Next slide, Chris. So as Lynn mentioned, we knew we didn't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's so much great work that has already been done in the area of outcome measures for victim services. So the first thing we did is we compiled and reviewed and classified a little over 1,000 existing outcome and service quality measures that are out there. Several states have their own systems. Of course, individual providers may have developed a survey instrument themselves. So we tried to get as many as we could and ended up with over 1,000 measures. And we also collected logic models from diverse providers as well. Next, please. Next, we conducted methodological review. So this is the how, when, and to whom instruments are administered to victims that have received services. So this was really important in helping us develop our toolkit that will go along with this project. Next. Then before we even put pen to paper and started developing any measures, we conducted a little over, I believe it was a dozen interviews with victims and survivors to get their perspective on what is important to them. What do they believe is an important outcome that we should include? And ask them also about sensitivity and sort of methodology of how we might administer this as well. Next, please. Then building on the work that Georgia has done, they've had a system in place for quite a long time now. So Georgia conducted focus groups with providers in their state to talk to them about the usefulness of the data that they're collecting on victim outcomes. Next. Then once we compiled the measures and done some of this other work, we identified the key outcome and quality constructs that the VOS, which will be our tool, should measure. So this comes from looking at sort of the frequency that certain measures are used in those existing tools. Also, we did a literature review trying to identify which short-term outcomes have been shown to lead to longer-term impacts for survivors. We want to prioritize those measures that have been shown to lead to that longer term benefit. Next slide. And of course, all along the way, we've been engaging DOJ and our expert panel to help develop the VOS, and now we've come up with sort of our draft instrument as we continue on with testing. Next.
Okay, so we've alluded to this already, but I just want to lay out exactly what the VOS will measure. So first, the survey will ask about outcomes of services, and outcomes are really just the extent to which a survivor's physical, emotional, psychological, social, economic, and legal needs were met through the services they received. And then next it'll ask about the quality of services received. And here we're talking about survivors' perceptions of how they were treated by the provider. So whether the services were accessible, whether they understood the information that was shared, whether they felt like they could be themselves with the provider, whether they felt supported, those types of questions. And then the survey will also ask some brief demographic questions particularly around the frequency and the duration of services received too, so that those can be used to provide some context around the findings. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide touches on some of the key considerations for the survey that are guiding our approach. The first two I alluded to earlier. The need for standardization is really critical to the survey development. Although we expect that the data will have a lot of value to individual providers, there's also a lot of benefit to being able to understand the impacts of programs at an aggregate level, again, like the state or the nation. And so we don't want to develop a tool that lets every provider essentially create their own unique survey, because then it would be very difficult to aggregate the findings or for providers to benchmark themselves against other providers. So we need to have some core measures that are consistent across all providers or sets of providers. But that said, to the next point, we know that certain outcomes are only going to be applicable for certain providers. So a provider that focuses on legal outcomes, like you were hearing about in the previous presentation, wouldn't want to have a client survey focused on housing stability, for example, because that wouldn't be applicable to what they're trying to achieve with those survivors. So we need to ensure that our core measures are applicable to the provider's intended outcomes of services. And then we also know that there needs to be some customization and flexibility, again, because the field is so broad and so diverse. So we're building that in as well. And then another big consideration, jumping down to the third block there, is the need to protect respondent confidentiality so that they feel comfortable giving truthful responses. And so the VOS is being developed as a one-time self-administered survey. And then finally, we're focusing on ensuring that providers can get high response rates, high participation rates from survivors. And this means keeping the survey really simple and low burden, so about 5 minutes to complete, and offering survivors the chance to complete it while they're still actively engaged with the providers. But once they're far enough along in their course of services, that those services should have had their intended impact. So there's a lot going on and going into the survey development. And with that, I will turn it over to Stacy to talk about some of the other project activities.
Thanks, Lynn. So in addition to developing the instrument and the methodology, we're also developing a software platform to host the instrument. So victim service providers or agencies or organizations will use this platform to select, customize, and deploy surveys to the victims and survivors they serve. We canvassed a variety of software programs to determine which would be most suitable for the purposes of the VOS, and we ultimately landed on Tangerine, which is a software application developed by RTI International. It's been used in over 1,500,000 assessments and surveys in 60 countries, 100 languages, over 50 organizations. And some of the key features are that it's open source, freely available. It enables use of different modules. In other words, we can customize it very easily, or victim service providers can rather. It can be used for interactive data visualization to support organizations and agencies and being able to apprehend and understand and manage that data. The software can be installed on any internet-ready device, and data can be collected in online or offline modes. There's secure collection and transmission of data, and we're able to program in many different languages. So for this reason, we're going with Tangerine. We're in the process of developing that software application for the purposes of this project now. Next slide, please. The third activity, beyond the instrument methodology and the platform, is to continue conducting rigorous testing. This is a lot of information on the slide. I realize we don't expect you to apprehend all of it, but what we do want to illustrate is the very phased and iterative, nonlinear nature of the project. We have design multiple testing activities that are informing both the development of the VOS instrument methodology and the platform on an iterative basis. So as designated in that first row and as Bailey clearly demonstrated, you can see both the expert panel and the existing work to date that's happened in the field, both informing the instrument development and methodology. And similarly, we have 3 rounds of cognitive testing that are, which I'll discuss momentarily, that are also informing that instrument development. Simultaneously, in the second row, you can see we're working, but the instrument development process itself is driving our software platform development. We're currently in the process of preparing for usability testing, and usability testing will be designed to ensure just that the usability of the software program among a wide variety of service providers, agencies, and organizations. We plan on recruiting and providing guidance to approximately 40 providers on setting up Tangerine accounts, selecting the appropriate outcomes, customizing their surveys, naming and deploying those surveys, and we'll be collecting data from them on how user-friendly and intuitive and easily navigable the platform is, and we'll use that data to make successive revisions to our software development application. From there, we'll be conducting a large pilot test with approximately 100 providers, and the purpose of that is to ensure the overall functionality of the instrument and the methodology, the platform, all of it. And that data will in turn, we'll be collecting data on usability and functionality, once again, on para data, response distributions, and other troubleshooting, just to ensure that when this is, set forth into the entire field, that it is performing and executing well and easy to use, because we know it won't be used unless it's easy to use. So all of these activities will inform the development of what we're calling our toolkit or our user guide. Very briefly, we just conducted, next slide, cognitive testing. And cognitive testing is an important tool for assessing respondent understanding of and ability to accurately answer survey questions. For those of you who are not familiar with cognitive testing, you can think about it this way. If we were to say, what time did you go to bed? One person might say what time they got in bed. Another person might answer what time they turned out their light, their lamp. Someone else might be thinking about when they fell asleep. We want to make sure that respondents are interpreting questions the same way, responding the same way, to just increase the validity of the data and reliability of the data. So RTI with partners has just conducted cognitive interviews with 43 persons impacted by crime who have previously received services to solicit their input about the way the survey questions are written. And we recruited participants who are 18 years of older, able to speak English or Spanish, completed victim services no more than 3 years prior. And we just wanted to really walk through this survey and get as much feedback from them as we could. Based on the feedback and suggestions we gathered through the interviews, the team learned that most measures are performing well and easily understood by respondents. And for those measures performing less well, the team is in the process of refining choices and response options to ensure that the VOS will collect rigorous and consistent data that service providers can use to demonstrate program impact on the lives of those who have experienced crime. Next slide, briefly. This is just a quick timeline. In the interest of time, I'm going to breeze right through that and pass it back to Bailey to bring us home.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I know we're up against our time here. So just quickly, we wanted to highlight, 6 key benefits of measuring outcomes in victim services and what this VOS can bring. It's really important to allow researchers and providers to concentrate on how lives are improving from the work of victim service providers, and to give victims the voice and the power to themselves comment on their perception of that impact. So thank you all so much. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide and pass it off to Sarah and Elizabeth.
All right. My name's Elizabeth Snell, and I am at the Muskie School. I'm the director of a project called the Measuring Effectiveness Initiative, where we work with grantees throughout the nation to help them measure their data that they are required to submit for their OBW grants. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you got a little feedback.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. I'll keep talking, and if it doesn't go away, let me know. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna run pretty quickly through my slides because I want to get to the exciting results that we've found so far in this project, which is a really wonderful sort of component of what these other projects are attempting to do. We're supported by a grant from the Office on Violence Against Women, like the other projects that are with us today. This is grant funded and may not necessarily represent the views of DOJ. And we have several partners in this work. One, of course, is OVW, our federal flagship, right, in thinking through developing capacity to reduce violence against women and victims and survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, trafficking. Then there's us, the VAWA MEI, as we're called. We've been around for just about 2 decades now. And then, of course, our partners at JRSA. Thanks for having us here, and thanks for being partners in this project. Next slide, please. So this work came about because if you've ever been an OVW grantee or a FIPSA grantee or an OVC grantee or any one of the other federally funded programs, you know that the data that you are required to provide in progress reports is, as my colleague Sarah Goen often says, is very broad and somewhat shallow. And what she means by that is that an OVW grantee, for example, completes some forms that are in some cases upwards of 50 pages. They might be asked about bed nights. They might be asked about victims served. Hotline calls, CCR meetings, referrals to law enforcement, cases charged, cases disposed. And what I'm so appreciating about this webinar is this, sort of this growing realization that we can be better gauging success, specifically on this project, in the criminal justice system's response. And what OVW and what we are trying to do with this is try to find sort of the praxis, right, of measures that are both useful to track, that help OVW better gauge the effectiveness of the funding that they're allocating out, and that are also not burdensome and are actually meaningful for grantees who are in the field, who in many cases might be tracking on paper, right? They might have the shelter coordinator have to complete these forms and provide these data points. In some cases, a coalition might have a data specialist, right? But in other cases, I think of some of our smaller domestic violence agencies. When I was an advocate, I worked in the attic, and twice a year would go around and we would do our level best to get these numbers. And every hour I spent on ensuring that we were complying with our federal reporting requirements was an hour taken away from direct service. So what our goal was again, as I say, sort of we are trying to find the sweet spot where we're finding indicators that are rigorous and robust that we can use, that OVW and others can use to measure the response to VAWA crimes, that are also useful to grantees. That then OVW can use to work on their grants management system and the data that they're sharing. My colleague Ginger Barron Lyons may also be with us. She is an analyst with OVW and continues to be just a champion of this field and of grantees and data-informed decision-making. Next slide, please. So we've chunked this into the sections of work, and we're deep in the middle of phase 3. The first thing we did, like other colleagues here, was look at that put together a conceptual framework that was based both on research and also practical experience. We use the conceptual framework in phase 2 to help us develop indicators that we could then ask VAWA grantees to test in the field to see, is it even feasible to collect this data? Could it be feasible at some point in the future to collect this data? And how could you collect this data? What would you need? And then the last is to distill that into a set of outcome measures that OVW can use, and other colleagues and other departments in the field can use then to be tracking progress. Next slide. So very quickly, in phase one, we looked at we took a similar approach to some of the work that my colleagues have talked about already, so I won't go through this, but this was the sort of planning and preparation phase. And then the next phase, if you go to the next slide, was our beautiful concept model. I'll turn this over to Sarah to take it from here.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So this is the working conceptual model that came out of that first phase, and it really reflects the outcome logic related to that wide range of OVW-funded programs and services related to law enforcement. And so the gray boxes are the major strategy areas in which programs work, and the blue box in the center shows the shorter term outcomes for law enforcement agencies and also perhaps for individual officers, and then how that work contributes to law enforcement agencies understanding and working to support the rights and interests of victims, which is that blue circle. We also wanted to show how the work at the officer and agency levels fits into that broader goal of victim outcomes and well-being, which is the brown and green pathway, as well as offender accountability, which is the pathway along the bottom. And then we used this map to guide us as we generated a list of 56 related metrics to pilot test in phase 2 with grantees. And those range from referrals to work groups and practices and perceptions and attitudes of officers and victim experiences. Yes, next slide, thank you. So the goal of phase 2 is to take this list of metrics and to pilot test them with OVW grantees to see whether they were available and feasible to collect in the field. And the pilot sites came from 3 OVW grant programs listed here. And all of the sites that we contacted and recruited from had reported that they use OVW funds to support law enforcement related activities. So we did want to narrow in on those that are actually working with law enforcement. And we recruited from a pool of 45 grantees, and ultimately 12 participated fully in the pilot period. To gather the information, we created an online data collection tool for the actual metrics, and then we conducted follow-up interviews with each site to gather information about the accuracy of what they provided, why they couldn't report certain measures, resource needs. And I should note that we did pay pilot sites a modest honorarium because we realized that this was no small request. This was actually going to take a fair bit of time. Next slide, please. So a few more details about the actual online tool. It covered 3 major areas: policy and practice, administrative data and case records, and the perspectives from officers and victims. Each section had some questions that were kind of straightforward counts or numbers, like the number of calls for service for VAWA crimes that we could look and track over time to see if there was an increase if grantees were reporting it over time. And then others which explored metrics like the law enforcement officer attitudes and whether sites could provide anything. And if they said yes, we asked for it. And in all cases, they could opt out and indicate, well, I could provide this in the future, but I can't do it right now. Or they could indicate that they could never provide that information. And those were things that then we explored in more depth in the follow-up interviews. We also included in our data collection tool some open-ended feedback questions about the process of gathering and reporting the data to get a better sense of burden. Being really mindful that we don't want to lay extra burden on sites. Next slide, please. So once we got all this information from pilot sites, we combined the data collection tool and interview notes into a giant spreadsheet, and then we looked at both of those pieces of information kind of concurrently. And we looked at what was most frequently reported, what measures could not be reported and why, and what was most meaningful to grantees and their confidence in the accuracy of the data. And using all of that information, we categorized the metrics into 3 big buckets: recommended, still under consideration, and not recommended right now. And so the recommended metrics, there's about 25 of them as of now, although that could shift a little bit, that rose to the top were ones where most sites reported they could collect this data now, or they could reasonably collect it in the future with some forethought and planning. So having an MOU with a partner or building the proper reporting filters, they could do it, but they just couldn't do it right now. We currently have, like I said, about 25 metrics that fall in that category, and some of those examples are things like ways in which they are communicating with victims, or various data points around the case clearance and case progression. So closures due to an arrest or to exceptional means and what those reasons might be. Again, things that could shift over time as capacity builds towards better serving VAWA crimes and VAWA victims. Next slide. There was also a small group of metrics there where we are still kind of considering how to handle them or whether or not they warrant being recommended. And this is when fewer sites said they could provide them, or they needed a lot more clarification, or they said the metric was just like not useful. And so, for example, a number of sites said they didn't quite know how to define trauma informed. So before moving forward, some of the indicators that we were thinking about for that metric, we would want to ensure that there was a clearer definition and maybe even some examples. Another one was referrals being made, because some sites said that that would be really difficult to track with their law enforcement partners, although we are leaning towards including it because it seemed rather important when we were talking with some of the sites. And then the final two examples here are regarding victim experiences, and some of the concerns that were raised by sites were not that this information wasn't being collected, but around who was collecting that information and whether victims would feel pressured to answer if it was being requested by a law enforcement agency, or if they would be honest in their responses if it was coming from a law enforcement agency and not a victim service provider. And so a lot of questions around the actual accuracy of what was being collected and how that could be effectively done by grantees. And I think our VOS partners are offering a lot of options there for those victim service providers particularly. Next slide, please. The last grouping is the not recommends, and this is the final group of metrics that did not make the cut, where sites said they could not ever produce that data because it was a really big lift, or it was just something that they didn't think they could ever provide or get buy-in from an external partner. For example, sites said it would be very difficult to track whether victims are utilizing referrals. But most of the metrics that we're not recommending at this time relate to prosecutorial and court data, like the cases accepted for prosecution or offenders' referrals to treatment programs. And we learned from our experiences that sites just have very limited capacity to collect this information and no control over how that's being tracked or reported or accessed. Next slide. In addition to highlighting details on feasibility and accessibility of metrics, the interview has also revealed some really important themes, and I'll just sling right through them real quick. Many of the grantees included in the pilot were interested and curious about how they can better use data to inform their work. They were excited and inspired to collect and use better data. And they were clear that they needed help to support that process. They could imagine collecting and reporting information if they knew it was an expectation and were given training and capacity building and resources on how to do that correctly. Next slide. A final big takeaway was that sites really needed more funding specific to building data and evaluation capacity for systems and staffing. A lot of data is being tracked on paper in different ways across agencies and offices. There's discrepancies in how different partners track information, et cetera, et cetera. So grantees were very clear that in order to make some of these changes, they would need dedicated funding to get those systems in place across their agencies and partners. Next slide. So where does that leave us in the final phase of our work? Well, we're still fine-tuning the concept map and the metric recommendations based on everything that we've learned from the pilot, and then going back through and revisiting the work of phase one, which included connecting with some an advisory board of experts from both the field and the academics. And then we will be reporting back to OVW and creating some additional dissemination products geared towards practitioners, geared towards evaluators, and geared towards researchers. But more generally than that, our hope is that the research agenda and data inventories and scoping reviews that we conducted can help drive research into areas where the concept model needs more exploration or we need more evidence of best practices. And our second hope is that the practitioners in the field can use this body of work and this concept map to develop their own program logic models and evaluation capacity, because we know that better data leads to better programs and ultimately to better victim outcomes. So I just want to thank you all so much for your time and your attention today. We're 2 minutes over. Our contact information is here on the slide deck, and please feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have about this process. More to come. Thank you.
I'm just gonna stop sharing at this point. If you did not get to, wait, stop showing screen, that's what I wanted. If you did not get to write down everybody's contact information, the slides will be available to you. For those who are able to stay, we will be doing a little bit of Q&A right now. A link was also placed in the chat box if you wanted to continue the conversation online at a later time. But I'm gonna toss it over to Bailey now.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we've had one question come in, and that was during our first presentation on the legal services project. The question was, are you willing to also share your client surveys? I know you just went through a couple of items, but I didn't catch them quick enough.
Oh. They will be included with the final report, yes. Actually, yeah, the final report is currently under review with NIJ, so as soon as they've signed off on it and blessed it, yes, those will be made public.
Great, and I'll say also for the VOS project, you know, given we did such a large collection of measures for all victim service providers, we are working on a way to share that as well. So we hope to be able to share what we collected so that no one else out there has to reinvent the wheel themselves. So let's see. We got a couple thank yous, a lot of lots of great info. Any other questions, please enter them into the question tab or chat if that's easier to find for you. That's the only question I have so far.
Okay.
And I know we went a little over time, so please feel free to email any of us with questions that you have after we end here today. And I put that in the chat as well, that JRSA, with the help of Jason's great work, has new and improved discussion boards. So we hope that you'll help us continue the conversation through those discussion boards after this ends. Okay, a couple more questions came in. Has anyone used victimization surveys to help develop data collection efforts in states? Does anyone want to take that one?
Is that something you looked at with VOS at all?
So in terms of victimization, that wasn't a focus of the instruments that we were gathering. There certainly has been victimization surveys done at state levels, and JRSA does keep track of that because often it's done by the SACs. But in terms of the VOS project, we were focused on outcomes of victim services and not necessarily their victimization experience. So that wasn't a focus for us.
Right. Yeah, that was similar for us with legal services as well.
And the next question is, are any tools being used across an entire state for all VOCA-funded agencies in that particular state? So yes, in fact, there is. Yeah, so there's several states where they are using a sort of standardized survey for feedback on outcomes for victim service providers. We know Pennsylvania has one. Georgia has a set of instruments they use. Let's see, I'm blanking on the others. Stacy, if you have others in your head, but there are numerous states that have implemented a statewide victim feedback survey. So Mark had a clarification on the victimization survey question. He said Connecticut is currently working on a victimization survey. Our state SAC is assisting with judicial branch, which is leading the victimization survey effort. Thanks for today's webinar. Yeah, Mark, please feel free to reach out to us here at JRSA. And, you know, as with anything, it's always easier to have an example to work with. So we can probably pull out some example instruments in terms of state victimization surveys. And Abigail is asking, can you please repeat where we are able to see the slides? So once this ends, Abigail, there will be a survey that pops up for you. And in that survey, you'll be able to check a box that will request the slides. And I believe Chris will post this on our website as well.
Chris had to hop off. Yes, it'll be posted on the website.
Okay, great. And Jenny, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to give you a full list of states that we found to have a sort of a statewide system in place. So those are all the questions I see. I know we're 8 minutes over. Karen, do you want to remind people about the survey and handouts?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the right panel where you were just putting in your questions and whatnot, the handouts drop down. If you just click on that, there are 3 handouts there that you can download and save. We also encourage you to complete the survey, and that'll pop up in your browser as soon as this webinar closes out. We do really value your feedback, and we actually do use that data. The information in this will be used as well to send you the slides.
Thanks, Karen. No other questions have come in, so we'll go ahead and wrap up since we're a little over time, but please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions, or if there are resources that we can provide to you, particularly, Mark and Jenny, if there are things that we can provide you to help with any efforts there. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you.